Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly informed on the stories that matter. Today we're looking at something pretty major. South Africa's 7th democratic national elections. They were held back on May 29th, 2024. And look, this wasn't just, another election. People were calling it potentially the most significant one in the country's democratic history.
Yeah, it's quite something. The weight of expectation around this one was huge. I mean, after 3 decades of, well, a certain political reality,
Right.
there was this real feeling, you could sense it, that a fundamental shift might actually happen. The stakes felt incredibly high for everyone.
You could absolutely feel that. Our main source for this deep dive is an article by Carrie-Anne Duplessis on the africareport.com. It's called South Africa's Pivotal Election, Voters Turnout in Millions. So our goal here is really to unpack what happened, the incredible enthusiasm from voters, but also the very real challenges they faced on the day.
Exactly. Looking at why people voted the way they did, the different motivations, and also the logistical hurdles, the stuff happening on the ground.
It really paints a picture of an election that felt like more than just ticking a box. It felt like potentially a real turning point. Okay, so the first thing that just, bam, jumps out from the article is the turnout. Incredible numbers.
Huge numbers. Millions of South Africans heading to the polls.
And we're talking like visible dedication, right?
Yeah.
Queues stretching hundreds of meters long.
Yeah, at all sorts of places, schools, churches, community halls, even temporary tents set up for it, right from 7 a.m. when polls opened.
So what does that kind of turnout, that waiting in line for hours, what does that really tell us?
Well, it speaks volumes, doesn't it? You had the Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, Masego Shaburi, saying something quite telling.
Oh, yeah.
He said, the steady flow indicates that we may match or surpass the 66% mark. That's out of nearly 28 million registered voters.
Wow, 66% or more. That's significant.
It really is, and it underlines why people were calling this South Africa's most important general election so far. It's not just numbers, it's active participation. It shows this deep commitment,
And this amazing turnout, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. It ties directly into what was really at stake here, the potential for a massive shift in political power.
Absolutely. This was the big story hanging over everything.
For the first time since the African National Congress, the ANC, came to power 3 decades ago, there was a real chance their share of the vote could actually drop below 50%.
Which is, historically huge, a potential game changer.
So what happens then if they do drop below 50?
Well, that fundamentally changes how South Africa is governed, at least in the immediate term.
Yeah.
The ANC would be forced, basically, to negotiate.
The form of coalition, right? Or
Yep.
that kind of deal.
Exactly. A coalition or some sort of governing agreement with one, maybe more, of the smaller opposition parties.
That really would be a pivotal moment, wouldn't it, after such a long period of dominance by one party?
It really tests the political system. How does a democracy that's mostly known single-party rule adapt to, the messiness of coalitions? It could mean more accountability.
Or maybe more instability.
Potentially. Forging stable alliances, that's always a challenge. So yeah, it's a truly fascinating moment in South Africa's democratic journey.
Okay, so knowing that this potential change was hanging in the air, let's get into the voters themselves. What were people thinking and feeling in those queues?
Yeah, the source gives us some really interesting, contrasting views.
Right, like on one side, you definitely hear this strong call for change. The article mentions William Molefe. He's 42, sells ice lollies in Mogal City.
And his story is quite clear. He's been voting for the main opposition, the Democratic Alliance, or DA, for 10 years.
And why? What's his reasoning?
He basically said he just couldn't see any difference in his own life after 2 decades with the ANC in charge. He's voting, hoping for things to get better.
He actually says, I trust and believe we shall govern. That's quite hopeful.
It really captures that desire for something new. And remember, the DA got, just under 21% in 2019. They were pushing hard to increase that. So Molefe's vote represents that push.
But then you have the complete opposite end of the spectrum almost, this deep, deep loyalty.
Exactly. The article contrasts Molefe with 2 young women from Sedibeng Township near Johannesburg. Nobam Gokwana, she's 23, and her friend Nakane Taihotio, who's 21.
And they're voting ANC.
Yes. Gokwana explains it very simply. She grew up in an ANC home. It's what she knows. And she says she'll teach her own child to vote ANC, too.
That's a powerful generational link right there.
It really is, but it also highlights this this generational divide that keeps coming up in surveys.
How so?
Well, the source points out that while Nobam and Neckine are loyal, a lot of their friends have actually moved away from the ANC. They're supporting newer parties.
Like the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters.
Exactly, the EFF, which itself is an ANC splinter group. Surveys do suggest younger South Africans feel less tied to the sort of liberation-era parties like the ANC. They're exploring other options.
Interesting. Yet, Kawana seems okay with that difference among her friends.
Remarkably tolerant, yeah.
Oh.
She's quoted saying, "Everyone has their own choice. We vote for ANC, and some of our friends vote for EFF, and they have their reasons, and we have ours. We grew up in this organization."
Wow. So you've got these really different forces pulling people, wanting change, versus this deep historical loyalty. It really does feel like a nation figuring things out.
A real crossroads moment, definitely.
But getting those votes cast, even with all the enthusiasm, wasn't always straightforward. The source also talks about problems on the ground.
Yeah, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were definitely some snags. Logistical issues, technical problems, causing some polling stations to open late.
And more serious stuff, too. Protests, tensions.
Yes, unfortunately, there were some significant incidents, like in the Eastern Cape, in Keiskammahoek.
What happened there?
Community protests over apparently unprocessed land claim payments. It got serious enough that they actually had to shut down voting stations there for a while.
Wow. And political clashes, too.
There were reports, yeah. In Seshego, Limpopo, that's EFF leader Julius Malema's home turf, there was a confrontation.
Involving who?
Jossie Buthain. He used to be Malema's close ally, now he's back with the ANC. He was protesting quite loudly about EFF supporters apparently campaigning too close to a voting station.
And wasn't there a more serious incident involving him earlier?
Yes, sadly. The article mentions an earlier shootout involving Buthain and some EFF supporters that actually left a 9-year-old girl injured. So, tensions were definitely running high in some areas.
That's incredibly intense. And there were even claims of interference with the vote counting.
In KwaZulu-Natal, yes. That's where another ANC splinter, the MK Party, was expected to do well. Electoral officials there reported that some unaccredited people claiming to be from political parties tried to interfere with their work overnight.
So with all these issues, the delays, the protests, the confrontations, the interference claims, did that dampen people's spirits? Did it affect the turnout?
Well, this is what's quite remarkable. According to the source, despite all these problems, these issues did little to dampen the enthusiasm of the voters.
Really? People just stuck with it?
It seems so. People seemed absolutely determined to vote, no matter the hurdles. It suggests a kind of deep resilience, a commitment to having their say, even when it's difficult.
Okay, so polls close at 9 p.m. Everyone's voted, despite the challenges. Then the real nail-biting starts, right? The counting.
Exactly. Vote counting was set to begin pretty much immediately after the polls closed.
And when could people expect to start seeing results?
Projections, maybe some early reliable indicators, were expected possibly as soon as Thursday morning, the day after the vote.
And it's worth remembering, South Africa doesn't allow exit polls, right?
Correct. No exit polls, so everyone really had to wait for the official counting process to unfold. Pure suspense.
There's also an interesting little detail about where the results were announced from.
Oh yeah, the results center. For the first time since the very first Democratic election in 1994, the National Result Operations Center wasn't in Pretoria.
Where was it?
It was moved to the Gallagher Convention Center in Midrand, which is between Johannesburg and Pretoria.
Any particular reason?
Apparently, the old venue in Pretoria had been quite badly vandalized during the COVID-19 lockdown and afterwards. So, a practical change, really, but still a little marker of changing times.
So wrapping this up then, we've seen this massive, passionate turnout, these deep loyalties sitting alongside a real hunger for change and some pretty serious tensions and challenges on Election Day itself. When you put all that together, what does this pivotal election really signify for you, thinking about South Africa's democracy going forward?
That's the big question, isn't it? It feels like a moment of potential transformation. How does the relationship between the people and the state, between citizens and governance, evolve from here?
Yeah, what does it reveal about that relationship in such a complex, diverse country?
It really underscores the power and perhaps the changing nature of individual voices within this huge democratic exercise. What happens next feels, well, genuinely uncertain, but incredibly important.
Definitely something to keep watching. And it makes you reflect, doesn't it, on the impact every single one of those voters waiting in line hope to make.